With most of the media focusing on Ukraine, it's easy to overlook the protests in Venezuela, and it's just as easy to assume that both countries face the same issues. In both cases, the demonstrators demanded the resignation of the president, but that's where the similarities end. To understand the ongoing protest movement in Venezuela, we need to go back to April 2013 when Nicolas Maduro won the presidential elections by 1% difference. The opponent Henrique Capriles refused to accept the results of the elections, claiming that there were election irregularities like ballot stuffing and coerced voting. But the National Elections Council dismissed the calls for a complete review of the allegations, and so the opposition and the government were set on a collision course. The people were gearing up for new mass demonstrations, and everyone knew there was a good chance for violence. But what happened next was that Capriles called the whole thing off, because he did not want any violence. His supporters were obviously disappointed, but Capriles was determined to challenge the results of the elections through the judicial system. Not only was Capriles' case rejected, but the court even fined him for offending the state. This became Capriles' second major failure, and it proved to be a disastrous one. It damaged his own reputation and also created a rift between the moderate and the radical wing elements of the opposition, with Harvard-educated Leopoldo López being one of the leaders of the radical wing. Now, López is being credited for being the leader of the ongoing protest movement, but it's simply inaccurate. It were in fact university students who started the demonstrations in response to a campus sexual assault. This set off a chain reaction, and as time went by, the demonstrations expanded to include mostly people from the middle class and upper class who were angry over the crime rates, police brutality, corruption, inflation, scarcity of goods, the media blackout, and the list of grievances goes on. But the point here is that the protests are extremely polarized, and there is no simple unifying theme. Welcome to a Caspian report for Made on TV by me, Shirvan. For more information, visit the website and social media pages. Now, it's fair to say that the situation in Venezuela was escalated by both the opposition and the government, with the opposition leader Capriles being an exception, as he is one of the very few who had continuously called for non-violence and negotiations. But in general, the opposition is using the economic crisis in the country as a pretext to challenge the rule of Maduro, whose main popular support comes from the lower classes of the country. But as I mentioned earlier, the opposition is drifting apart, and this becomes more apparent when you take a closer look at the situation. For example, opposition member Corina and Lopez have propelled their own careers forward by discrediting Capriles for shaking the president's hand in order to ease the situation down. After all, one man's failure is another man's success, and both these politicians have had significant successes in raising their own reputations at the expense of the unity of the opposition. So this essentially shows just how polarized the opposition movement really is. But it's not just the opposition that is fragmenting. The ruling class is also dealing with an internal power struggle amongst its key players. And this is where Venezuela's political crisis becomes much more complex. Some of the main contenders within the ruling class include President Maduro, Speaker of the National Assembly Cabello, former Finance Minister and now Planning Minister Giordani, and President of the state-owned oil company Ramirez. Since the death of Chavez, this inner circle has been working around the clock to consolidate their positions in the new government, and even though publicly they seem united, there is in fact a growing tension among them, especially between Maduro and Cabello. And the origins of this steadily growing friction goes back to the death of the late president Hugo Chavez. Now, Chavez's reputation is controversial in Western media, but he was very popular in Venezuela, mostly because of his successes in reducing poverty and creating the most equal distribution of wealth and social system in Latin America. Chavez's charisma and influence on Venezuela is second only to Simón Bolívar, the key military and political leader behind Latin America's struggle for independence. If Simón Bolívar equals George Washington, then Hugo Chavez would equal Abraham Lincoln. That's how much Chavez changed the country, and that's how much of a gap he left behind. And that vacuum has only been growing in the past year. President Maduro's authority is now effectively being challenged by President of the National Assembly, Cabello. President Maduro's insecurity becomes more apparent when you look at his continuous reshuffling of military and security personnel and finance ministers. But things really started to heat up in November 2013 when Maduro appealed to the National Assembly to pass a legislation that would give the president the ability to pass law by decree. Cabello reluctantly allowed the legislation to pass, fully knowing that it would set the balance of power in favor of Maduro. But as a response to this, Cabello has since then stepped up his political campaigning. In November 2014, he traveled to the western side of the country to dismiss military personnel charged with corruption and smuggling. He also started his own weekly TV show, similar to Chavez's former political show. This was followed by Cabello's negotiation with the opposition leader López, who had earlier surrendered to the authorities. And in a country like Venezuela, where charisma and personality means more than democratic institutions, this gives the impression that it is Cabello who is in charge of the country, not Maduro. One more important factor in favor of Cabello is his influence on the Colectivos militia. Now, the Colectivos is a security mechanism composed of pro-government activists, and in some ways it actually resembles Iran's volunteer militia, the Basij. Now, it's not entirely clear who controls the Colectivos militia. It could be the Interior Minister, Rodriguez, but it could very well be Cabello himself. It's noteworthy to mention that the deaths of the protesters in the month of February were mostly instigated by the Colectivos. Somebody from the higher echelons of the government gave them the permission to violently suppress the demonstrators. But the friction between Maduro and Cabello does not mean the conditions are ripe for a coup. Maduro has one key advantage, that is the backing of Cuban special forces. What you have to understand here is that Chavez integrated Cuban forces in Venezuelan internal security as an insurance policy against potential coup threats by his own security forces. And since Maduro has close relations to the Castro brothers in Cuba, the loyalty of those Cuban troops in Venezuela is unquestionable. Furthermore, Maduro still has the support of the lower class, which forms his primary support base, and unless the president actually loses his support base, his government will not break. For now though, some of the country's leading opposition members have agreed to hold negotiations with the government, and this suggests that at least a portion of the opposition wants a negotiated settlement rather than a violent takeover. These negotiations are taking place amidst a fragmentation of the opposition and the splitting of the ruling class, and all of this is taking place at the worst possible time. The country still has to face its biggest challenge, the dysfunctional financial system. In the next report, we will explain the origins and the reasons why Venezuela is facing a scarcity of goods and a growing inflation. For now, this was Caspian Report for Maidan TV by me, Shirvan. For more information, visit the social media pages in the description section. And as always, thanks for watching and Sahol.